The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our monthly Core Advocate webinar. Tonight's webinar is Collaborative Learning with Math Mini Assessments. We are going to get started in about 1 minute, and if you are used to joining our webinars on a regular basis, you probably know that we usually have handouts, but for tonight's webinar, we don't have any handouts. So you can just sit tight for about 1 minute, and we will be starting shortly. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again for everybody for joining us this evening for our Collaborative Learning with Math Mini Assessments webinar. We're going to start off tonight with a poll to find out how many Core Advocate webinars you have all joined in the past. So go ahead and take a minute to complete the poll. Great. So it looks like most of you who are joining us tonight, this is your first Core Advocate webinar, so welcome. We're happy to have you here. And it looks like almost everybody else has been to 1 to 10 webinars, and we have a few seasoned Core Advocates who have been to lots of our webinars in the past. So thank you for everybody for joining us. We're happy to have you, and we have a really great webinar for you tonight. So we're going to get started with some introductions. On the webinar tonight, your hosts from Student Achievement Partners Professional Learning Team are myself, Jenny Beltramini, and my colleague, Tori Filler. We are also excited that we have some guests this month from SAP, Ostred Fossum, who's a Senior Mathematics Specialist. And then we are honored to have a great Core Advocate guest tonight, Michelle Douglas Meyer, who is an instructional coach. We'd like to tell you a little bit about Core Advocates, especially because so many of you are new to the webinar tonight. Core Advocates are teachers from all over the country who believe in the potential of high quality standards and the importance of all students being prepared for college and careers. And they support their colleagues in understanding and advocating for the standards and embrace the shifts in instruction. And the Core Advocate network right now is over 12,000 educators strong, and we'd love it for all of you to join us in our network if you have not already done so. So to learn more about the Core Advocate Network, you can certainly email me. My email address is on the slide. You could also complete our survey to join the network, and the web address is there, or just visit our website at achievethecore.org to learn more about the Core Advocate Network. So we are avid tweeters. We hope that those of you who tweet will live tweet during the webinar tonight and follow the tweets that happen. Please feel free to use the hashtag Core Advocates, and you can follow Student Achievement Partners at achievethecore.org, and my Twitter handle and Ostred's and Michelle's is also there. So thank you for doing that. And we'd like you to know that we'll have a few interactive opportunities on the webinar tonight. So ways that you can engage with us. You won't be accessing any documents because we don't have any handouts tonight. All of our resources that we're going to be sharing are available online, but we will ask you some questions during the webinar tonight. So you can use the question tab on your control panel, and we'll also be using polls. And after the webinar, we will send you a survey. We would love for you to fill it out and let us know about the webinar and what you thought of it. And also you will get access in that email to the recorded webinar, including all of the slides, and all of the hyperlinks are live on the slides so that you'll be able to access all of the materials directly from the slides that we discussed tonight. So we have 3 main goals for our webinar tonight. They are to understand how to recognize high quality assessments aligned to the shifts required by college and career ready standards. Also consider Student Achievement Partners mini assessments for mathematics as a model for high quality aligned assessments. And then you'll get to learn how educators have used the mini assessments within a school district and the impact on students, teachers, and achievement. So we're going to dive right into section 1 tonight and begin talking about how we can recognize high quality assessments aligned to the shifts required by college and career ready standards.
But first,
we're going to, oh, go ahead.
First, we have a quick poll about how familiar you are with next generation math assessments, and you'll see that pop up on your screen in just a moment.
Great, thank you for all taking that poll. It's exciting that over half of you have never utilized next generation math assessments, so we have some great learning for you tonight. I know you're all going to leave with really great ideas and resources and tools that you can use. And even if you have used our SAP mini assessments and or even written your own next generation type assessments, we know that tonight will be valuable for you. So thank you for taking the poll and for being here, and we're going to go ahead and launch right in. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Astrid Fossum, who's going to get us started with learning about next generation assessments.
Great, thank you so much, Jenny. Like with everything at SAP, we really ground our work in the shift in mathematics, so thinking about focus, coherence, and rigor, and in particular with tonight's topic, really thinking about what that means for assessment. So hopefully you'll walk away with some ideas for implementation, as well as gain more familiarity with design features and components of the mini assessments as well. So we have begun with the shifts, which do provide a frame that really describe how Common Core, state standards, other college and career ready standards really raise expectations across instructional materials and across instructional practice and assessment for students. And the shifts really illustrate how every standard contributes to transformative changes in the classroom that will better prepare our students. So we're going to take some time to kind of break apart each of these 3 shifts and kind of moving from a traditional approach of assessment to a next generation approach. And the first way we'll do that is on the next slide with focus. And kind of that traditional approach, what we're moving from is we're moving from covering content that's a mile wide and an inch deep. This first shift calls for a greater focus in mathematics, and traditionally US standards were arranged in a way that gave equal importance across all areas, whether that was statistics and probability, number and operations, measurement, geometry, and algebra. And what we know now is that rather than racing to cover topics in a mile-wide inch program, we want the standards, and the standards actually require us to significantly narrow and deepen the way we spend time in the classroom and the way we assess. So we are assessing fewer topics at each grade level. We are no longer giving equal importance to all content areas, but with assessment, we're really thinking about dedicating the large majority of score points, spending the most time, whether it's having the most assessments, pulling from the major work of the grade or the widely applicable prerequisites in high school. And if you aren't familiar with the major work of the grade, you can look up the focus documents in the on Achieve the Core and the widely applicable prerequisites for high school there as well. So there are 2 items on the next slide that I want to give you a minute to look at. One is just They are actually separate. Read the first question across the top and then the item. Typically, which is our standard. So before grade. Think about this shift from
I'm going to dive in because we're losing your audio just a little bit. So maybe I can take this slide and talk about it, and then you can clear that up, and we'll have you come back in. Tori, do you want to hit the? Oh yeah, thank you. So what Oxford was saying is that in the first traditional assessment question, even though it is about equal shares for second grade, they are also bringing in the symmetry concept, and that is now in the new standards, not introduced until fourth grade, and is a later concept that's saved for later on. And so that would not be the type of item that we would want to see in a next gen assessment, because we don't want to assess content that's outside the grade level. And in the second example, around equal shares, it's really about the pictures on the rectangles and which ones show half. And so that is aligned to the second grade geometry standard around equal shares.
Can you hear me now?
We can, and I hope I did a good job of saying what you meant to say.
I wasn't listening because I was panicking, so I'm sure you did.
So I think we can go on to the next slide.
Sounds good. So we're going to dive into the second shift, which is coherence here, and really think about that question about how next generation assessments are different. And when we think about coherence, we think about connections across grades and connections to major topics within the grades. And traditionally, assessments have kind of been treated as lots of items, kind of as a checklist for individual standards. So check, am I covering every single standard, every single substandard, every single cluster or domain within my course or within my grade level? And assessments now, we really want to think about connections to standards, connections to clusters and domains where they're naturally happening. Certainly there are going to be times when we are still assessing individual standards, but it's important to think about now as you're writing your own assessment items, as you're reviewing items within your materials, or as you're thinking about how we've developed our mini assessments, some of those connections that are there. Likewise with coherence, moving from every topic is kind of an independent or isolated event to thinking about consistent representations, familiarity for students. Assessments are no longer really meant to be a trick at all for kids. Assessments are not a trick. They should know what is expected of them. They should know what they are even given an opportunity to showcase for you what they understand and are able to do. And when students have had experience across multiple grade levels or courses and are familiar with representations, are familiar with connections, and are allowed to build on previous knowledge, then we have opportunities to see the illustrations and the evidence of understanding in their work. One of the ways to look and think about coherence is on the table on the next slide, which is across addition and subtraction in grades K through 4. And you can think kind of across the grades. We've got partial circles where students are introduced to topics for addition and subtraction within the content limits. And we've got circles that are completely shaded in. where we see that this is secure knowledge for students and that they should be fluent with addition and subtraction within 5, 10, 20, and so on. So you'll see connections within the grade. I'm going to look at grade 2 within 20, within 100, and connections for place value into 1,000, as well as connections across the grades from K to 1 within 10, from 1 to 2 within 20, within 100, from grades 2 to 3 within 1,000. So, you know, to understand that kind of vertical alignment and that progression in math content helps make more a coherent assessment system as well. And finally, we have the shift of rigor, which again is another big change. I grew up in a time where I probably had lots of procedural assessment items. So we're moving from that shift with really an unbalanced emphasis, either all procedural skill and fluency or word problem after word problem after word problem and lots of application. And what we see now with next generation assessments, we thought about with the design of the mini assessments, is really balancing all 3 aspects of rigor. So you'll see items that measure conceptual understanding, procedural skill and fluency, and applications with equal intensity. Often there have been, and traditionally I would say, a lack of items that require conceptual understanding. And we're thinking and writing items that really require students to demonstrate conceptual understanding and not just kind of jump to procedural skill. Fluency items and application items should also not always just be routine or contrived. We want to see fluency items that are presented in new ways, as well as routine problems, application items that are routine, but also really allow students opportunities to make sense of mathematics and model and use argumentation in real world situations. So we've got an example on the next slide, which I want to give you a minute to look at as well. Always with math webinars, we never have enough time to do all the problems. And so here we have a 5th grade example of a conceptual problem. And this is an item that doesn't really require a procedure. Hopefully we've got multiple solution paths. Students may have 1 7/10 as 17/10 and 17/12 and look at 2 fractions and compare the 2. But there are other ways to solve this problem. We know that there are other students that are going to look at the 1 7/10 and the 17/12 and say, 17/12. Well, that's 1 5/12. 5/12 is less than a half, so 1 7/10 must be bigger. In a lot of procedural problems, you'll see that students have an opportunity to explain or justify their reasoning. And that can be with words or pictures, whichever way you would like. And we also have a procedural skill and fluency example here, moving kind of from that traditional vertical alignment that implies that students need to use an algorithm to solve, to something more like the chart on the right, which I want to give you a minute to look at too. And I kind of mentioned this before, but you'll see a difference that the problems here are given horizontally. That vertical orientation on the left implies that there's a paper and pencil calculation to be done, but practicing to become fluent with the 3rd grade OAC 7 standards requires that students know these facts from memory. And so the horizontal orientation is meant to encourage students to use their memory and resist that urge to calculate. Another difference you'll see is that the items are more intentional. We're moving to unknowns in all positions. And there are multiplication and division problems mixed together. I don't know how many times, you know, we've had students that will all say, and we're probably all in that boat, oh boy, now we're on division and I'm not going to remember what to do, or they seem like this is a new isolated, a new completely independent topic rather. And so we're kind of making that shift and moving away from that for them.
Great, so we would love you all now to pause and answer the question on the screen. What obstacles do teachers face in adjusting to the new style of math assessments? And you can type your answer into the question tab on your control panel to respond. We'll give you a few minutes.
Great, thank you for all of your answers. Feel free to keep the answers coming in. Although you can't all see what each other answer, I will begin to share them out and reply all so that you'll be able to see some of the answers that some of our webinar attendees are giving. But some of the things that I'm noticing, one kind of theme is either time to make the assessments or finding good next generation assessments. So we will hopefully address that in our next sections on the webinar tonight. I also see shifting the mindset of, in some cases, teachers, and some are even mentioning parents and students in terms of the demands of these new assessments. And then another obstacle that a couple people have mentioned, or a few people have mentioned, is just teachers having the content knowledge or the conceptual understanding themselves to be able to make the assessments and use the assessments with students as well. So we will thank you for all of your really thoughtful responses, and I think we'll be able to address a few of these obstacles on our webinar tonight. And like I said, I'll begin to reply to some of them and share out what the attendees tonight are saying so that you can all see some of the thoughts and comments. So I'm going to pass it back to Astrid now to talk with us about section 2, using SAP mini assessments.
Great, thanks. So hopefully I think that this will help with question and responses before around finding some good mini assessments. And after we get through section 2, Michelle will definitely be sharing some strategies around building content knowledge around assessment 2. So there should be something for everyone coming up. But SAP has created mini assessments to help teachers, educators really better understand what high quality assessment looks like. I went very, very quickly through the 3 shifts and love to talk about this. So definitely follow up with questions if you would like. But for you now, we have a screenshot of the landing page on achievethecore.org where you can access the math mini assessments. On the left, you'll see that you can filter assessments by grade. And there happen to be 22 math mini assessments. They come from grades 2 through 8. And in each of those grades, there are 3 mini assessments. One targets each aspect of rigor. So there's a mini assessment in each grade 2 through 8 for conceptual understanding, for procedural skill and fluency, or for application. Currently, there is one high school mini assessment, and that is on quadratics. When you get the recording of the webinar, go feel free to go back to this slide, and there's a link there, so you can click on the link, and it'll take you right to this landing page on the Achieve the Core website. And here we have a screenshot of an example of a math mini assessment that this has been developed for grade 2. As with any of the mini assessments, this could be used for advanced students at a lower grade. It could be used for less advanced students at a higher grade. This one happens to be one of the 3 that would filter when you get to grade 2. This is the mini assessment that Michelle will be specifically referencing later in the webinar. So you might be wondering, well, what's actually in these mini assessments? When you go back and dig in and achieve the core, you'll find that each of the mini assessments has all of these components. And the first is an overview, really meant for the teachers to explain the grade level, the connections to the content, the standards that are were selected and are being assessed within that mini assessment. Sometimes there are multiple standards, sometimes it's a domain, or sometimes it's one standard in on its own. And there's a rationale for that decision, as well as some of the components or like design features of the assessment. There's also front matter and information on making the shifts, which so connections to the shift of focus, connections to the shift of coherence, as well as rigor, and really a closer look of what the content is and the pieces that are there. Those are all really meant for the teachers, for the educators, instructional coaches. The next component in the math mini assessment, in each math mini assessment, is the mini assessment itself. So there is a blank student page that can be run off or downloaded that way. And then there's an answer key, and there are annotations. So teachers can have the answer key. Those could also be for students, just really depends on use case. And then within that front page, the front pages of each math mini assessment, there are links to the progression documents. Those come from the University of Arizona, if you aren't familiar with those. So kind of another look at the content that's being assessed on the mini assessment, as well as a link to the focus by grade level document for each grade. So you'll find out if that assessment is major work.
Great, and we'd love to pause for another question, which you can type your answer into the control panel just like last time. How could you use SAP's mini assessments in your setting to improve alignment to high quality assessment? And we'd love to share out some of your great answers in just a bit.
Great, thank you for all of your answers. Tori and I will share them out also like we did on the first question. Some people have said to use them as exemplars for writing teams that are writing assessments. And so that's a great way. I know some of you had mentioned in the first question an obstacle is just having models of what assessment items look like. And so these are good exemplars. Other people, several people have mentioned using them as formative assessments to inform instruction and make informed decisions about students and student learning. So that's great. Other people have talked about using them in PLCs and to help sort of norm or come together on student responses and student learning. So those are great ways to use them as well. So Tori and I will continue to share out some of the responses of webinar participants, but we're going to go ahead and transition to our third part of the webinar tonight. And I'm excited that you'll get to hear a really specific example of how someone has been using the mini assessments in their settings. And so part 3 is hearing from educators, an educator, about how the mini assessment has been used. And so I'm excited to introduce our core advocate guest tonight, Michelle Douglas Meyer, and I will let Michelle introduce herself and take it from there.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here tonight. I am an instructional coach in Milwaukee Public Schools, and I've worked mainly with mathematics in elementary schools, so K4 through 5th grade schools. In my role as coach, I am able to observe and engage in classrooms and with teachers and students. And as I began to do this recently, I began to notice some patterns among our primary students, or our primary classrooms and the students. They were struggling with story problems, not unusual, I don't think, particularly though with the more challenging problem types. They also were not having a lot of exposure based on our curriculum materials to those more challenging problem types. So they were really getting access and experience with some of the simpler problem types and not a lot of experience and exposure to the problem types that are typically more challenging for our students. Because of this, I chose to work with my teachers at a grade level meeting and use one of the mini assessments from SAP as the basis for our conversation and our work during that grade level meeting. The assessment that I chose is the one entitled Representing and Solving Addition and Subtraction Problems, and it focuses on 2OA1, the standard around story problems, and it's an assessment that focuses on conceptual understanding. So as we met, we followed the process that you see on the screen. The teachers and I took time to take the assessment. We took it individually, and then we had some conversations about the content that we noticed on the assessment. We took a look at the structure of the tasks, and then we did some formal planning. And I'll go into more detail about each of those steps over the next slides. So the first thing we did was take the assessment. We each took the assessment on our own, solved each of the 15 problems individually, and once we had completed that, we went over the answers. We were teams that had been working together a while, so the teachers felt safe to discuss particular problems that they struggled with, even admit that maybe they misunderstood the task or the question in a certain problem, but it allowed us to have conversations about where students struggle as well. So as we reviewed the problems, we were able to take a look at the standards, and we read through those beginning pieces of the mini assessment packet, which were the overview and the making the shifts section. So that gave us some background on the development of the assessment. Then we went and looked at the math content. So this particular assessment, as I mentioned, deals with story problems. And as we began to talk about the story problems, I shared the closer look section with the teachers, which includes the chart that you see on your screen. We had some experience with this chart, which is the different problem types for addition and subtraction that students are expected to master by the end of 2nd grade. And we took a look and discussed the differences between the various rows, the top section, the middle section, and those compare problems at the bottom. And then we discussed the different columns, the different pieces of unknowns that we asked students to grapple with. As we talked about them, we went through each problem on the mini assessment again and mapped it to a particular problem type. So this assessment has one problem written for, could you go back a slide a second? Thank you. So this assessment has one problem written for each of the 15 problem types that you see on the chart. And we had a conversation as we mapped each problem on the assessment to one of these problem types. It allowed us to take some time to revisit this really important content in kindergarten and 1st grade and 2nd grade. Now, if you could go ahead and move back to thank you. A second piece of content that we discussed related to how to support students' conceptual understanding of a particular problem. As we work to make sense of the problems as teachers, we found that some kind of representation might be helpful. So it led us to a discussion of tape diagrams and how they provide a really nice visual of the relationships between the quantities in a given problem. The tape diagrams are referenced in the progressions document as a representation that lasts a long time, that students can use it from very early on through intermediate, middle school, and beyond, depending on, or independent of the different types of numbers that they're working with. So we practiced drawing tape diagrams for several problems and began to understand how the two different diagrams that you see on your screen support student understanding for particular problem types. For example, the compare problem that you see at the bottom is best represented by the compare problem tape diagram that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. The last conversation that we had around the mini assessment was about the structure of the tasks themselves. We noticed that some of the questions asked students to solve and provide an answer, but some of them were formatted like the number 8 problem that you see on the screen. Students weren't explicitly asked to find an answer. Instead, they were asked to think about what might be an appropriate equation for students to use, whether they would use it themselves or another student might possibly choose to use that one. As we talked about this format, one teacher commented that students really must shift their thinking, how they independently might solve the problem, to think about how other students would, and that's really difficult for our young students. In order to really think about how someone else would solve this problem is really challenging for our kids in first, second, and second grade. So these 3 conversations that we had during grade level meeting around problem types, tape diagrams, and the task format were really powerful to teacher teams and prompted us to think about what we might do to instruction as we move forward. So as we thought about next steps in our planning and in our work with students, teachers decided to pull individual problems and use them as samples or models in order to give students more experience with the less frequent problem types presented in our curriculum. So often those were our compare problems. Sometimes they were our start unknown problems that students struggled with and didn't get a lot of experience with. Secondly, teachers looked in their curriculum and pulled some individual story problems that were already provided and changed the format of them to model some of the formats in the assessment from SAP. So students would get some more variety in what they were asked to do as they engaged in these story problems.
So I actually just tweeted a link to Michelle's blog post. She wrote a blog for our Aligned series, explaining and outlining in a little bit more detail the PLC opportunities that the teachers had looking at this second grade math mini assessment. So you can find that there. You can go on Achieve the Core and search for the Aligned post as well. But we do have some additional uses for mini assessments that Michelle has used within her building as an instructional coach has seen teachers use. Some that as assessment specialists at SAP we've seen and talked to people across the nation that are some uses we see probably the most. And one is really kind of a quick pulse check on how students are progressing on grade level content. I would be remiss if we left the webinar today and everyone thought that the mini assessments had to stay intact and they had to be administered only once. The mini assessments are in PDF and they are in Word format, so teachers have the opportunity to modify them and give even one problem at a time if they want. And even, they can give them in multiple administrations over the course of the year. Oftentimes we know our students are struggling with their mathematical fluency, and one of the uses we've seen is a really kind of nice running record of did multiple administrations of a fluency mini assessment throughout the course of the year to gather timely information. Another use case that has kind of come up is that, and Michelle did talk about this when she talked about the multi-select problem in 2nd grade, is exposing students to various formats of questions. While we don't have technology enhanced items on our mini assessments, there are various formats that have been part of our conversations and actually in the design of the mini assessments. And we do try to mirror and show formats that students might encounter on a summative assessment. So when we think about that multi-select problem with the yes, no's for the equation, what a nice opportunity for 2nd grade students to familiarize themselves with multiple types to prepare themselves for assessments at a different grade even. And finally, sometimes students just aren't really understanding why their responses were correct or incorrect. You know, we know that they learn from their peers, and sometimes students are really visual, and they might benefit from seeing the annotations that are at the end of the mini assessment, especially if all of the pile of student work happens to come back kind of looking the same. It's nice to have an exemplar at times from outside of the group to share with the students. But again, lots of different use cases, and probably even more that you are using or in your setting or even thinking about as the night has kind of progressed.
Great, thank you, Michelle and Astrid, for all of the information and the great ideas about ways to use the mini assessments. Now is the time when we open up. Some of you might have questions for either Astrid or Michelle or both, and so we'd like to offer you the opportunity to ask them questions. You can use your question tab if you have a question, and I'm going to actually start us off while you're taking a minute to write your questions with a question that I've already seen come through in the chat box or in the question tab. So, and I think Astrid, you have something to share about this, but somebody has wondered about using the assessments for English language learners and some of the vocabulary demands that are in those assessments, and so you might have something to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, currently SAP is embarking on ELL adaptations for our mini assessments. And so if you were to go on to the Achieve the Core website and print and download every single mini assessment today and not go back over the course of the summer and then come back in the fall, you will probably notice some changes. The mini assessments are one of the things that we always try to improve, and we are working on them right now with some specific L scaffolding strategies, and they are being updated. We found, and writing items is very challenging, that there were times when we referred to something as a bundle and as a kit in the same problem, and we're really trying to streamline a lot of the vocabulary demands within those. As I mentioned before, the mini assessments are also in Word format, so you could make specific modifications to fit the needs of your learners as well.
Great, thank you. Somebody wanted to know, Michelle did that process around building teacher knowledge with the 2nd grade mini assessment. Has she done it with other mini assessments? Are there other mini assessments that process would work for? Would it work for any of them?
There is a nice assessment for grade 5 that goes over a couple domains, multi-domain assessment, that I would also use the same process with. Also an assessment in grade 8 that would work well.
And I would say for grade 8, it's really nice to look at those mini assessments with Algebra 1 teachers, because they'll see some of the coherent connections between what's happening in middle grades to their content as well. And it really opens that nice conversation that Michelle elaborated on about the content and the prior knowledge and skills that students are coming in with, as well as areas for support.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Michelle, somebody asked the question, how long did that process take to go through with the grade level team?
We took about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes to go through with each grade level. It was a little shorter with the kindergarten teachers because they really kind of were focused on just the problem types that they worked with at their grade, and longer with the second grade teachers because we really had to consider all 15 problem types and think more carefully, or more thoroughly, I would say.
Great, and that didn't include time for the teachers to take the assessment, is that right?
That did include about, that was maybe 10 minutes or so for them to take the assessment themselves.
Great. Astrid, you can answer this, but somebody wants to know if there are high school mini assessments. I know you already responded about the 8th grade assessments being used by Algebra 1 teachers, but there is a high school assessment, correct?
There is one high school assessment on quadratics right now. That is all that we have there. And there are no assessments for kindergarten or for 1st grade.
Great. Astrid, maybe you could answer this question. Somebody is wondering about how the standards for mathematical practice fit into this, as using the mini assessments for those.
That's so awesome. Thank you, because I didn't really talk about that at all. In the components section, so on that, like kind of the teacher overview and the do the math and connections to taking a closer look, you'll see that there are oftentimes, connections to the standards for mathematical practice. We did not tag because, as with instructional materials, very common in assessment, you'll see a lot of over tagging of standards for math practice. I would say the standards for math practice that we specifically call out are when you're going to see a really nice modeling task. And you can actually kind of look across the suite of mini assessments and see how mathematical modeling grows across the grades. And then opportunities for students to critique the reasoning of others and use argumentation and justification. And those are going to be constructed response problems where students are explaining and justifying their reasoning and thinking. So item format goes into some of the mathematical practice decisions that were made on the mini assessments. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
Great, good questions. There's a question that I will answer, and then feel free if anybody else has questions to put them in the question tab. But somebody asked, are there mini assessments for ELA? And my answer to that is yes, there are, and they're available also on Achieve the Core. And actually last month's webinar, so our May webinar, was all about the ELA mini assessments. And so you can find all of our past webinars archived on Achieve the Core. And you can get the recording from the webinar as well as the slide deck and the handouts for that webinar as well. So if you're interested in ELA mini assessments, do be sure and check that out as well. And then many people are asking again where to find the mini assessments and where to find Michelle's blog post. And so I know I put in the question tab, I replied all to somebody with the direct link to the math mini assessments, but if you just go under classroom resources on our main Achieve the Core webpage, you can find assessments there, and also just it's easiest to search in the search bar for aligned blog to find the aligned blog post. So I think we're almost out of time, but maybe Astrid, somebody was asking again about the K1 assessments and why don't we have those. So maybe you could respond to that really quickly, and then we will begin wrapping up our webinar.
Yeah, so we have not written kindergarten and 1st grade mini assessments at this point in time, knowing that they would, for age appropriateness, nearly all be kind of a one-to-one activity that they would be doing with teachers in an interview format. And given some of the other design features that we have and possible use cases, it's just something we haven't started to do right now. I'm thinking, I'm holding promise to the idea that there are going to be some really good things out there that are provided by vendors and early childhood specialists.
Great, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up our webinar tonight. We hope that if you found tonight's webinar helpful, we'd like to invite you to join our Core Advocate Network. We are committed to solving real problems that real teachers have, and we know the best way to do this is to know more about what folks are experiencing out in the field. And so while you hopefully learned a lot of information on our webinar tonight through your comments and through your questions, and through your dialogue with us, we learn a lot about all of you as well and what works for you and what you're doing in your setting. So we'd love to know more about who you are and where you work and the types of things you're interested in and the expertise you already have. This way we will be able to tailor our webinars and other opportunities to your needs and interests. And we may even tap you to be one of our next webinar guests. So we encourage you to join the network by filling out the survey at achievethecore.org/CA sign up. And also, we would love for you to share with us what you're doing more broadly, whether it's if you try a strategy or a tool from tonight's webinar, or if you're using something else at Achieve the Core, we'd like to know how it went. So please let us know about your advocacy with our instructional advocacy action form. And like I said earlier, when you receive the materials from tonight's webinar, the hyperlinks will be live on the slide deck, so you'll just be able to click on there and take the survey. And again, we'd love for you to join us again in the coming months. Hopefully you learned a lot tonight and would love to continue learning with us. So we have 2 great summertime webinars lined up. One is Student Achievement Partners guest David Lieben is going to be talking about the problem of teaching literacy backwards in July. And then our SAT math specialists, Marnie Greenstein and Shelby Cole, will be talking in August about not making every math strategy a separate lesson, developing understanding and skill with K-4 operations. And so normally our webinars are on the first Wednesday of every month, but in July that happens to be the 4th of July. So we have pushed both July and August webinars back to the 2nd Wednesday of each month, and the links to register are on the screen, and they'll also be live when you receive the handouts and the materials from tonight's webinar. So thank you again for spending your evening with us and joining us, and we look forward to having you join us on a future webinar. Have a good evening.